this is how we look at the world that we live in, and this is what the old ones say. My elders and the community that I raised, where I was raised, and this is how they express it. And this is not Iroquois people taking control of the whole continent. No, it's not at all. Or the Haudenosaunee or the Ongwahome or the Wisconawajage. This is how they talked about it. They said, where the sun rises in the east is the eastern door, and where the sun sets in the west is the western door, and the blue sky over our head is the roof of one long house, and all the people who live in that long house are one family. And so we have a rafter. And as you can see from the depiction on the slide, there are rafters all the way across. So there's the Mi'kmaq rafter, there's the Abenaki rafter, there's the Cayuga rafter, there's the Potawatomi rafter, there's the Saulteaux rafter, there's the Pagan rafter, there's the Cree rafter, there's the Nisga'a and Quahiu, all the way out. Everybody's got a rafter in that longhouse. And as you can see, we're all braced by a covenant with each other of eating, healing, and protection. So our braces for those rafters include a conscientiousness with each other to protect each other. No one eats until we all eat. No one is happy until we're all happy. No one is healed until we're all healed. Everybody gets to eat. Everybody gets to be healed. Everybody gets to be happy. Those are the foundational principles that bind those rafters together and make the house strong. So what does that have to do with what we're going to talk about today? Well, over the years, I heard the elders say these kinds of things, and they would say, if it wasn't for our people, Canada wouldn't be a nation today. And then they would say, where the sun rises in the eastern door, and they'd talk about the rafters. And they would also teach us things like how they started to describe the two-row wampum, and the way they phrased it was like this: we were happy to raise you up in our land, is what they said to the crown. So over the years, I was puzzled by what they were talking about. Like you do when you talk to elders and they say something that kind of goes over your head. But after you think about it and you wonder what they're talking about, you begin to piece it together. And that's what our story is going to be about today. Let's go to the next slide, Jody. So here's what happened in Canada over the last 10 years. You have two prime ministers in a row. And they looked at what was going on in the country with the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, with Indian day schools on reserve, with boarding schools or residential schools off the reserve, and the idea of when they took children away from their families in the 60s. And these things were said to be very painful for the Native people. And two prime ministers in a row agreed with that. And I won't tell you what you can read yourself, but Stephen Harper said, we've been carrying, this is talking to us, you've been carrying the burden of what we did to you for far too long. You're not going to have to do that anymore. We're going to partner with you to remedy what we did to you. And then when he accepted the calls to action of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, Justin Trudeau said the same thing, almost word for word, and that he put it on the country and the government of Canada that what they did was a bad thing. It created pain, and that now we're going to fix it. We're going to help. We're going to work with you to do that. What is that about?
Jody must be running low.
Is your computer running out of gas, Jody? There you go. So, as you can see, the Apology for Indian Residential Schools said, the burden of this experience has been on your shoulders far too long. And they called it a burden. And that's fascinating that they would call it a burden. And that we have been working on recovering from this for a long time, our people in our communities and so on. And that Trudeau said a nation-to-nation relationship. It's fascinating that he would use that word nation-to-nation. Let's roll along with our show before we run out of gas, Jody. So a total renewal of what relationship was he talking about? What was, and believe me, the Governor General of Canada, the Queen of England, the Prime Minister of Canada, and the Ministers of Indian Affairs know this story. Believe me, they know this story. That's what they're referring to. Roll along. So they're talking about extending the rafters now. We got Tigadis on the Winasano is a way that we talk about it. Sagodia Dinyonde, that we're going to move the rafters. And as you can see from this depiction here, this is a longhouse frame that I and my son Marcus built actually down on the reserve. And we had it with a few other folks that came and helped us do that. And you can see the rafters and you can see the braces for the rafters in that particular type of architecture. And so this is what this is referring to. Sagodi Adinyonde means they adopt them. And Tigadisonde Winasaro is how we say the rafters are moved. And when we add something to the long house that goes from the sun rising to the sunset. Let's go again, Jody. And as you see, there's the relation, the 2 row says that we stood you up in our land. Like I said a while ago, that's how the 2 row works. And it'll last as long as the sun rises. All right, let's go again. And that there's belts, wampum belts that commemorate that. These are the different types of belts. On the left side, you see the rafter belts, and then to the left, right of that is the longhouse belt. That's the many built a house, and you can see the encoded sign language in there. Many built the house. Okay. So, what do they mean when they're talking about that now? Tiga wenio con wisnohora wajage doga de honda honjoni on sagodinyon de ne chionqueta squajira doga une onka ne quachira ke. Uwara ne honda wanondo se doga une on sagod wanondo se. They're saying that when some part of the longhouse has good feelings for someone, or a family, or a clan, or another people, they can adopt them. And it has to be accepted by the whole family to adopt them in. That's how the adoption works among our people. Okay, go again. So, in 1867, colonies over here, Upper Canada, Lower Canada, they decided they wanted to be a nation state. And they had the British North America Act that was completed in England by the Privy Council and the government of England to create the Dominion of Canada. That was in 1867. We know about it. We just had the 150th anniversary a couple years ago. The honor of the crown meant that Queen Victoria had to send somebody to confirm that, and she sent her son to Brantford, Ontario, at the Mohawk Chapel. This is where a special event took place on October 1st, 1869, with Arthur the Duke of Connaught, the 19-year-old son of Queen Victoria, who came to Brantford. Let's go to the next slide. So here's what happened. When he came to Brantford, he stayed at the Kirby Hotel, and he went deer hunting down at Long Point, down on Lake Erie. And this was in late September. And then on October 1st, the whole entourage from Brantford, the privileged classes of people came in their carriages and went to the Mohawk Chapel in Brantford, Ontario, and they took Arthur the Duke of Connaught there. And he received then what they call a condolence ceremony. And at the ceremony, They hung a name around his neck, and according to the United Empire Loyalist Gazette and writers from the International Orders of the Daughters of the Empire, on that day, Canada's rafter was raised inside the Longhouse of Many Nations. This is how they say it. This is not us saying it. This is Canadian people saying it. On that day, Canada's rafter was raised inside the Longhouse of Many Nations. Let's go again, Jody. So this is out of a history book, and he was given the name Garakonye. And I got the slides backwards here because I should have went to this one first, because it shows the depiction of exactly what happened. Now, let me tell you how I found out about this based on what the elders were telling me about. If it wasn't for your people, Canada wouldn't be a country today, and we stood you up in our country. Well, this came from my work on a film called Where the Spirit Lives. This was back in the 80s, right at the frontier of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission over residential schools, actually. And I was doing some research, and I found a woman by the name of Jane McGarry and her memoirs. And she had been they had the branch of the IODE in Lethbridge, Alberta, named after her. And she had in her memoirs handwritten notes of these events. And Angela Fines, of course, from the United Empire Loyalists here in Brantford, also had records as well. And what they said was Karakonye, that's a wolf clan name. That's a real wolf clan name, was hung around the neck of Arthur. And they also said at that time, this is what happened. On that day, Arthur was taken and led by the arm up down the rows of people that were gathered by the Mohawk Chapel. And he'd talk as he went, and he would stop and he would address the people. And how they do naming is where they have a warrior or a boy is taken and presented to all the mothers, to all the warriors, and they're all reminded now this child is your son, and you will teach him what he needs to know about doing what he has to do as a warrior. And as he went, and as the IOD and the UALers say, he exhorted as he went, leading the chief around there and singing too, right? Wait, wait, oh, wait, how we are, wait, hey, oh, hey, oh. Hey, hey, oh, hey, how we are, wait, hey, oh, hey, oh. How we, hey, oh, hey, how we are, how we, hey, oh, hey, how we, hey, oh, we, how we are, how we, hey, oh, we, oh. And as he went in and led him by the arm, singing as around, he came finally to the place where they sat the prince down on a mat with a birch bark pail full of water, and they took white buckskin and wiped his eyes with the water. And then they took more water and wiped his ears from with the water, and then they gave him a drink out of the water that they had there. And for those who, as I'm reading this, I'm going, holy moly, that's the condolence ceremony. That's one of the big ceremonies, the wiping of the tears. They say, I was greatly startled by the sound of your voice as you come to this place to the wood's edge, because of all the calamities that could have befallen you on your way here. Trees could have been fallen and across your path. There could have been wild beasts could have devoured you. Pestilences could have gone you, or you could have saw the pond where all the ancestors are and wanted to throw yourself in, or there would be people with weapons in the dark outside the cabin. So we give great thanks that you've come here. And we will now smoke together and we will console each other with very few words. This was done for every lieutenant governor and every governor that came to North America by our people. They were all given the washing of the tears, wiping of the tears ceremony. And that's what they did in Brantford. And after that, the prince stood by the fire, grasping the wampum, as you saw in the previous slide there, with the young fellow holding the wampum string. He stood by the fire and addressed the people in our language. I heard what you said to me, and that's how I'm going to govern myself into the coming days. That was recorded by the UELers and the IODE, and that's when they said, and on that day and on at that moment, Canada was added as a rafter to the Longhouse of Many Nations. Let's go. There's a picture. It actually happened. I'm not making this up. There's a picture. I won't say anything about it. Believe your own eyes. Funny thing about Arthur, the Duke of Connaught, he came back to Schweigen, down 100 kilometers south of Toronto to the Six Nations Indian Reservation, or Six Nations Indian Reserve number 40, Oswego, or Oswego, is what it's known. He came back in 1913. And significantly, what happened at that time, he was given the condolence again because his mother had died in 1901. And so Arthur, when he came back, they wiped his tears again because Victoria had died. One other thing about that was Arthur, the Duke of Connaught, in 1913, was the Governor General of Canada. So joining with Canada and declaring war on the Kaiser, that's happened, and there are letters actually in the archives that show about our people saying their involvement with the war. 400 people went from here over there, and with the commemoration of Vimy Ridge recently, there are records from our families of our grandfathers going over there and participating in that. I had some uncles and grandfathers. My grandfather went to that campaign, and we're in those first tanks and all of that stuff. Another story. But when the war ended, Edward, Arthur's cousin, came to Brantford. And if you go drive through Brantford, there's a park that has a cannon in it. It's called Victoria Park over on Colburn Street. And they had another ceremony. And they gave Edward the condolence ceremony, but they conferred on him a chief title. Deahonseya was the name they hung around his neck. And they said, we've got a rafter here, a Canada rafter, but it has no chief to talk to the rest of us. So they made Edward a chief because the rafter needs a chief to be able to talk to the chiefs from the other rafters, because that's the role of the chief, to go and talk to the other nations and the other people about what we're thinking about stuff. That's their role, right? Fascinating fact. Edward became the King of England. Deahonseya, that Edward, became the King of England. So this is in Canadian history. This happened 100 years ago. And it's not taught in your schools for some reason that I don't know. You'll have to go ask the people that run your education system about that. But these events actually did happen. Queen Victoria in 1869, she declared all the native people in Canada to be members of the British Commonwealth in the late 1800s. She died in 1901. Arthur, her son, came back as Governor General of Canada to receive the condolence ceremony. His cousin Edward was conferred with a chief title and became Chief of the Canada Rafter. Let's go on. And just what I told you about. We got to have, there needs to be a place, a forum where people can talk. And that was what was created when Prince Edward was conferred with a chiefship title and later became the King Edward of England of the British Commonwealth. And there's the printed fragment from a history account of what happened. So in 1880, after Canada was adopted in, we have to brace Canada to the rest of the rafters. So here's what the chiefs did back in 1880 on June 21st. They adopted the Indian Act. It says it right there. These are minutes from the chief's records. The chiefs on June 21st, 1880, confirmed the acceptance of the Indian Act. Now, this was the Indian Act in those days was not the same document that we know today has control of our lives. That document was an instrument for Canada or the Crown to honor its treaty obligations. It was well known it had to have legislation, enabling legislation to allow a government to spend money. And out of that relationship, so the Indian Act braced the Canada rafter to the rest of the longhouse. And part of the agreement was this, it's right in there. 2 seats were going to be allocated in the legislature for people to sit there and watch the government govern over our affairs in Toronto at Queen's Park and in Ottawa. That was part of the deal. So the Indian Act was not put in place for the Crown to watch us. Actually, the chiefs adopted the Indian Act for the exact opposite reason, to keep an eye on them, because now we've braced the Canada rafter with the Indian Act to the rest of the longhouse. Of course, it became an instrument for all kinds of other stuff in the next 130 years or 140 years, but at that time it was thought differently. And makes a question. Romeo LeBlanc, who was Governor General, made National Aboriginal Day June 21st. Oh, that's because it's the solstice of the sun? Or does the Governor General know something about what happened to make Canada a country? Canada became a nation when it was braced to the rest of the longhouse on June 21st, 1880. Okay, let's go. So you have the Canada rafter adopted in. You have, as you saw at the start, the Trudeau and Harper, leaders of the Canadian rafter, and the things that they had to say about what happened in the 160 years since Confederation. And that there were certain events that we did to try to create then a relationship with the new Canada rafter. Is there another slide there? And in that rafter, when the adoption of Canada and it was given its own rafter, there was a duty and responsibility for people who are part of the Canadian rafter to become Indigenous to this land. You were given a rafter to become Indigenous to this land, the Canadian rafter. One thing, we don't call you settlers. That's your own eggheads and university researchers call you settlers. We don't do that, right? You call yourselves settlers, and the word colonizers comes in there, and all of those words come in there. But if you were adopted in and given a duty and responsibility to become Indigenous to this land, I don't think I can call you a settler or a colonizer anymore. Because of the family of one long house idea, I have to call you cousins. And 2 prime ministers in a row said our cousins have been pretty creepy towards us, did some pretty nasty things. So I can only ask you now, when you were given a duty and responsibility to become Indigenous to these lands, did you? Are you? Is there another slide there, Jody? So the family of one long house in 1869 has a definite historical record that shows, and people can debate about, why things happened. I'm not debating why things happened. I'm just reporting and telling a story about what did happen. This happened. What does it mean? That's up for you all to think about. So this is why we say now, ne gadine yagwano shinido yagwadadi winio, ne yagwaya non hawi chiniochi eti satsuragoha wadiragero, and wahine yonkiawine yakujiragero. Your ancestors and our ancestors made covenants a long time ago, and they were handed down to us, their children. And this is one of the covenants. What are you going to do about that is the question that we should all be asking ourselves. Where the sun rises is the eastern door, and where the sun sets is the western door, and the blue sky over our head is the roof of that longhouse, and everybody who lives in that longhouse are one family. There might be 35 million Canadians, but you only have one voice. There might be 2,000 Abenakis, but they also have a voice. There might be 40,000 Mohawks, but they also have one voice. Each of the rafters has a voice in that longhouse of one family. That's how it works. Where are we today? That is a discussion. Are we at the end of the slideshow there, Jody? There you go. The admission by two prime ministers in a row that our cousins have been pretty nasty to their other cousins from the other rafters. So you can shut that off, and I'm going to just pose a question, and then I'm going to shut off my camera and listen.